Pull up London on any satellite mapping service. Trace the familiar bend of the Thames, locate the bridge, the dome of St. Paul's, the Tower to the east, Westminster to the west. It is all precisely where you would expect it to be. Now remove the dome, remove the bridge as it exists today, remove every building constructed after 1666. What you're left with is a city that most people alive have never seen, and that the history books have never quite brought into focus with the precision the evidence actually allows. The year is 1640, and London in 1640 was a city doing something that quietly defies the logic of how we usually talk about history. It was functioning, it was alive. It was building, trading, printing, preaching, performing and dying in enormous numbers from plague and poverty, while simultaneously standing on the edge of a political catastrophe that would, within 2 years, send its king to war against his own parliament, and within 9 years send that same king to the executioner's block outside his own banqueting hall. A Bohemian artist named Wenceslaus Hollar walked these streets in 1640. He produced engravings of such precision that modern historians have been able to cross-reference their details against archaeological excavations and found them accurate to within meters. What Hollar recorded was not a ruin, not a myth, not a medieval abstraction. It was a functioning metropolis of 500,000 people, the largest city in the English-speaking world, in the final years before everything that defined it would be either burned, overthrown, or deliberately forgotten. If you have followed Past Pulse for a while, you know we do not deal in simple answers. London in the 1600s, examined carefully, tells a strikingly different story from the one most documentaries present. Not a story of inevitable progress, not a backdrop for political biography, a story of a city that was, in the most literal sense, living inside a question it did not yet know it was being asked. Begin at London Bridge. In 1640, this was not a bridge in any sense that the word now implies. It was a city stacked on top of a bridge. More than 200 houses and shops extended along its full length on both sides, creating a corridor so narrow that daylight rarely reached the road surface beneath. The structure stretched nearly 300 metres across the Thames, supported by 19 stone arches so closely spaced that the water between them was compressed into violent churning channels. Watermen, the professional Thames boatmen who ferried passengers across the river, refused to pass under the bridge. The hydraulic pressure generated by those arches created conditions lethal enough that there was a London proverb, still in use in 1640. The bridge is for wise men to pass over and fools to pass under. Merchants operated from the upper floors, children grew up in rooms that cantilevered over open water, noise was constant, smell was worse, and at the southern gatehouse, displayed on iron spikes that had been in continuous use for centuries, were the severed heads of traitors. This detail does not fully add up with how the London of this period is typically presented. Those heads in 1640 were not relics, they were recent. The years immediately preceding the English Civil War were years of accelerating state violence against political dissent. Archbishop Laud, Charles I's closest ecclesiastical ally, had ordered the ears of religious dissenters physically removed for publishing unauthorised pamphlets. The display on London Bridge was not barbarism as a holdover from an earlier age. It was a deliberate current policy of intimidation. What if London Bridge in 1640 was the most honest single structure in England? Because here, within 300 metres, you had commerce, domestic life, and the severed consequences of political opposition, not separated into different parts of the city, occurring simultaneously in the same physical space at the same moment. That compression, the idea that profit and peril could share the same foundation, is the defining architectural fact of London in 1640. Cross to the South Bank. The moment you stepped off London Bridge into Suffolk, the administrative reality of London changed entirely. The City of London's legal jurisdiction ended at the bridge. The Bishop of Winchester held authority over Suffolk, and it is a measure of how that arrangement worked in practice that the women who worked in Suffolk's brothels carried the formal designation of Winchester Geese, named after the bishop whose oversight they technically fell under and who collected a portion of the revenue those establishments generated. The Globe Theatre stood here, or more precisely, what remained of the Globe Theatre stood here. Shakespeare had died in 1616. The theatrical tradition he had shaped was approaching its final years. The bear-baiting arenas stood adjacent. The crowd moved between them with no apparent sense that one was art, and the other was not. But there is another body of evidence that complicates the simple picture of Southwark as mere chaos. The bear-baiting pit and the globe occupied plots of land separated by approximately 40 metres. Contemporary records describe the same audience attending both on the same afternoon. And the playhouses of Southwark, in 1640, were publishing a quantity of printed drama, quartos, folios, collected works, that would constitute the foundational archive of English literature. Less commonly discussed is what was about to happen to all of it. 2 years after 1640, the Long Parliament, dominated by Puritans who regarded theatrical performance as morally indefensible, would close every playhouse in England. They would not reopen for 18 years. The audience crowding into Southwark in 1640 was watching the final legal performances of an entire theatrical tradition. They did not know that. They bought their tickets, they took their positions in the yard or the galleries, and they watched. History never announces itself. What if Southwark was not the disreputable edge of London, but its most honest centre? Because it was the place where the city kept the things it wanted but refused to officially endorse. The contradiction that defined Southwark defined the whole city. Southwark simply made the contradiction visible. Move north, move west, find St. Paul's Cathedral. What stands on Ludgate Hill in 1640 is not the building that occupies that site today. Wren's Cathedral, the dome that defines the modern London skyline, does not yet exist. What stands in its place is the medieval cathedral, immense, Gothic, and visibly in decline. Its spire, struck by lightning in 1561, has never been rebuilt. The tower that remains in its place is a truncated, incongruous addition to a structure that now appears unfinished at its own centre, and surrounding it, in the churchyard and the surrounding lanes, is something that functions as the information infrastructure of the entire city. The booksellers, printers, and pamphlet sellers of London had clustered at St. Paul's Cross for decades. In 1640, with the King's censorship mechanism, the Star Chamber, crumbling under political pressure it could no longer sustain, the presses around St. Paul's were producing at a rate that contemporary observers described in terms approaching apocalyptic. Religious tracts, political arguments, counter-arguments, denunciations of counter-arguments. Sermons thundered inside the cathedral condemning parliamentary resistance to Charles I. Pamphlets circulated outside the cathedral arguing the opposite position. The distance between the pulpit and the stall selling the pamphlet that contradicted it was, in some cases, under 10 metres. The detail that does not fully add up is what happened to all of this material 26 years later. When the Great Fire of London began in September 1666, the booksellers and publishers of St. Paul's Churchyard moved their stock into the cathedral's crypt for safekeeping. Stone walls, no windows, fireproof, they believed. The fire burned hot enough and long enough to collapse those stone walls and incinerate everything stored behind them. Contemporaries estimated that the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of individual volumes were destroyed in the crypt of St. Paul's in those 4 days. London before the Great Fire was not only architecturally different from the city that replaced it, it was informationally different. A body of knowledge that took a century to accumulate was destroyed in 96 hours. What if St. Paul's in 1640 was the last comprehensive record of a world about to be erased? Not a cathedral in decline, a library on a countdown. Continue west, leave the city proper. Westminster in 1640 occupied a different moral register from the streets you have just walked. The buildings were larger, the approach was more deliberate, and inside the Palace of Westminster something was occurring that had not occurred in 11 years. Parliament was sitting. Charles I had ruled without Parliament since 1629. The constitutional, financial and ecclesiastical disputes that had made parliamentary sessions unmanageable had caused him to govern by royal prerogative alone, a period that parliamentary opponents called the 11 Years' Tyranny, and that Charles's supporters called legitimate sovereign governance. What ended it was not principle. It was money. A war against Scotland, triggered by Charles's attempt to impose the English prayer book on the Scottish Presbyterian Church, had left the Crown bankrupt. Parliamentary taxation was the only mechanism available to fund a settlement. Charles called Parliament. Parliament arrived in November 1640 with 11 years of accumulated grievances and no intention of limiting itself to the financial question. Less commonly discussed is the geographic proximity of what was about to happen. Westminster Abbey, 200 metres from the Palace of Westminster, contained the tomb of Edward the Confessor, the king who had founded the English monarchy at that precise location nearly 6 centuries earlier. The parliament that was about to dismantle the monarchy was meeting in the building constructed for the monarchy, 200 metres from the tomb of the monarchy's founder. History compresses its contradictions into small spaces. What if the single most important political confrontation in English history was, in spatial terms, essentially a local dispute? Westminster in 1640 was not an abstraction. It was a neighbourhood of perhaps half a mile across, within which the entire constitutional future of the country was being argued by men who could see each other's buildings from their windows. Follow the river east, past the bridge, to where the White Tower has stood since 1078. The Tower of London in 1640 was not a museum. It was an active instrument of governance, and in the final years before the Civil War, it was being used at a frequency that suggests the political crisis was already further advanced than the official record acknowledges. The Earl of Strafford, Charles I's most capable and most ruthless administrator, was imprisoned in the Tower in November 1640. He was executed on Tower Hill in May 1641. The crowd that gathered to watch his execution is estimated by contemporary sources at 200,000 people, roughly 40% of the city's entire population assembling to witness the death of one man. That number does not fully add up with the picture of a city going about its ordinary business, but there is another body of evidence worth examining. Inside the tower, the crown jewels were stored, the physical objects that embodied the continuity and legitimacy of the English monarchy. Within 2 years of the Civil War beginning, there would be serious parliamentary debate about whether those jewels should be sold, melted down, converted to currency to fund the war against the man they had once crowned. The Tower in 1640 was simultaneously the most powerful symbol of royal authority in England, and a structure that royal authority could no longer meaningfully defend. The garrison was inadequate, the political will to use it was eroding, and the Parliament 2 miles upriver was moving toward conclusions that would make its symbolism irrelevant. What if the most honest measure of a political system's stability is not its constitutions or its armies, but the condition of the building it uses to threaten its own citizens? Move away from the stone, follow the Thames east of Lambeth Palace, and the city begins to change its character. The embankments lose their formal edge. The buildings thin. The marshland asserts itself at the river's margins. Swans move through the reed beds. The continuous sound of the city, which, if you have been paying attention, has been present since London Bridge, begins to separate into its individual components, and then gradually to fail. 500,000 people lived inside the densest urban environment in the English-speaking world. Plague moved through it at irregular but devastating intervals. Starvation in the worst parishes was not an abstraction. Childhood mortality in some districts exceeded 50%, and yet. Fishermen worked this reach of the Thames in 1640 using methods unchanged for centuries. Families walked here. The river that carried the refuse and the commerce of the city also carried its quieter hours. London in the 1600s was not only a spectacle and a crisis, it was also a place where people lived. Ordinary, specific, largely undocumented lives inside a history that had not yet declared itself. Wenceslaus Hollar recorded this too, not only the landmarks, the texture, the river on a particular day, the quality of light at a particular hour, the visual evidence of ordinary persistence in a city on the edge of catastrophe. That is London in 1640, not a backdrop, not a period setting, not the inevitable prologue to Wren's Reconstruction or Cromwell's Republic, but a functioning city, chaotic, overcrowded, politically unstable, and precisely specifically itself, in the final years before everything that made it what it was would be either burned or overthrown. The Great Fire of 1666 would destroy 80% of the medieval city in 4 days. The English Civil War would execute its king and then restore his son within a decade. And from that sequence of catastrophes, something recognisable as modern London would eventually emerge. But before all of that, for one last sustained moment, there was this: 500,000 people living inside an architecture they had not chosen, governed by arrangements they had not fully consented to, in a city that was, by any reasonable measure, magnificent. History never announces its turning points in advance. If you want to explore another chapter of history the mainstream has underestimated, the next video is right here. We will see you there.